let me start by saying that Bing Nursery School is the place where I've learnt an enormous amount about children's language and language use over the last 40 years or so. In 1970, soon after I came to Stanford, I began to collect data from children and families at Bing in order to find out how children assigned their first meanings to words and how they refined these meanings as they acquired more words and more language. Over the years, I've learned from children in the classroom as well as from younger children, one-year-olds, who we invited to come during the summers when school wasn't in session to take part in adult-child sessions so that we could look at interaction as well. And what I'd like to do is give you a very brief tour of some of the kinds of findings from studies that my students and I have done over the years. So let me begin with focusing on what my main preoccupation has been, and that is how children attach meaning to words. They get very good at segmenting out forms of words. This starts during the very first year of life, but by the time they get to be about 10 or 11 months old, they also start attaching some meanings to those words. And the question is where those meanings come from. And I think probably there's a fairly general consensus now that there are two major sources of those meanings. First, the kinds of conceptual categories that children have been establishing through their perception and cognitions about the world around them, which start obviously as soon as they open their eyes at birth. And secondly, they get meanings also from how adults are using language about those kinds of categories in context when they interact. And one of the first domains that I did extensive studies was of spatial terms in English. So very simple prepositions like in, on, and under. When do children learn the meanings of these forms? Now, if you've ever taken a one-year-old to a pediatrician's office, you know that one of the things they do is hand the child a little plastic cup and an object and say, put the block in the cup. And every single child, without fail, puts it in, at which point the pediatrician says this development is normal. And when our pediatrician did that, I said, well, you know, if you give them any kind of container and something that can go in it, they'll put it in. So this actually isn't telling you whether that development is normal. And it certainly is not telling you that they know the word in at this stage. And our pediatrician didn't want to listen to me. But what I did do was start out with some very simple little pilot tests with some very young children. I actually looked initially at 18-month-olds, and I just took two plastic glasses and I put one upside down and one the right way up. And I gave the child a little toy mouse and said, sorry, actually I put rabbit on the slide, didn't I? Well, I remember it as being a mouse in the cup, and all of them put it in. Some of them, there were actually two little objects that could be placed. Some of them turned the other cup the right way up and put that one in too. At which point I thought, whoops, the other part of this is not going to work. So I turned the cup back up, and then I said, put the mouse on the cup. No one put the mouse on the cup at that age. They always turned the cups the right way up and put them in, and that was all I could get. So what we did was devise an experiment where we took objects where you could have two different spatial relations. So we had, for instance, a little toy crib where you could put something in it or under it, a truck where you could put things in it or under it, a table where you could put things on or under, a box lying on its side where you could put things in it or on it. And then what we did was give children a whole series of instructions to place different objects on these landmarks, if you like, reference points. And the results, if we look at the three youngest age groups, so these were mean age 1-9, 2 years 3 months, 2 years 9 months, you can see that within they were doing spectacularly well, as you might expect from the preface I gave you. With on, they're around chance at 1-9. It wasn't actually chance. It was if the other option was in, they got it wrong. If the other option was under, they got it right. And under, they did spectacularly badly on. They got it right about half the time by 2 years, 3 months, but suddenly at 2 years, 9 months, they jumped up and they were getting it right. So what was going on? We did not think that they understood the words in the instructions, namely in, on, and under. But what we reckoned was that basically if they took the location to be a container, then they always assumed that X went inside it. If the location was not a container, but it had a horizontal supporting surface, then X went on top. And these conceptual preferences make some meanings easier to map than others. That is, Rule 1 favors getting the mapping of in right very early for a language like English, and favors it over, on, and under. But of course, with a language like Spanish, it would remain very indeterminate because you have N for both in and on. But later, once children have got the contrast between in and on in English, then both these rules, it turns out, favor these two prepositions over under. And so they have to work to get the meaning of under in contrast to in and on. So we went on and explored the whole field of other prepositions as well in English, and we found these same two rules, the second rule at least coming back, not the first one, because that always takes priority, but the second one came back in other situations. So if you looked at on top versus underneath, then it turns out they always seem to get on top right, because you were testing it where you were looking at a surface that could support things. And what we did was explore then how children built up this whole semantic domain of spatial relational terms. We also looked, as we followed up this work, at terms like here and there, this and that. In fact, my co-author on this is in the audience, CJ Sengel as was. And we found that children like to take themselves as the reference point with things like here and there initially, and only later figure out it wasn't themselves, it was the speaker who was important when you used here, meaning near the speaker, there, away from the speaker, and so on. So this was one of the first areas where we looked at a range of different semantic domains. We looked at dimensional adjectives like big, small, tall, short. We looked at kinship terms, and in every place we found that children would start with the most sort of concrete properties that belong to the category. So with kinship, a brother is a boy, or my favorite, absolute favorite definition, a brother is a boy who has pants with pockets. That was, and I should say that was from a 5-year-old. This stuff is late in some cases. In the early 1980s, I started getting interested in what children knew about word structure. Could they break up complex words into different parts, so a stem and an affix? And I was drawn to this by noticing that very young children would spontaneously coin words when they didn't know the conventional word for something. So I put up 2 examples here, which were pretty characteristic. D at 1:11:28 wanted his mother to read Lion in the Meadow, and he said, read a lion book, as a way of saying. Now, lion book is a nice compound noun. It had stress on lion, less stress on book. This is a standard way of making a new compound in English. And if you start listening to 2-, 3-, and 4-year-olds, these kinds of novel compounds are all over the place. Another child at 2-7 was asked to explain why his baby sister was crying to his mother, and he said, I broomed her. And he had a little toy broom, and what he'd done was hit his sister with it. And again, making nouns into verbs in English is a process that's been productive in the language since the 1100s. So this is nothing new in English at all, and you can probably think of many new coinages that have come with the advent of the internet and email and all this kind of thing over the last 20, 30 years. But there are other ones that you find every day in more mundane circumstances as well. So one of the things we did was think, well, to get at analysis, what we can do is just ask children what particular people do, and where we give them as a label for that category a word which is not usually used in that way or just doesn't exist in the language. And so if you say to a 3-year-old, I've got a picture of a person called a stopper. What does a stopper do? He, and you start with this unfinished intonation contour, and if you're lucky, and actually children are very good at doing this, and they enjoy these sorts of word games, they'll say, he stops things, or he stops, or just stops things. They may not use the pronoun. And to elicit nouns like this, we would say instead, I've got a picture, and it was always just a picture of someone's head, so it never gave them any clues at all. And we didn't bother to show it to them unless they said they wanted to see the picture, and then all they saw was a picture of a man or a woman, boy or girl, cut out of a magazine, mounted on a card. And we'd say, I've got a picture of someone who moves things. What could we call someone who moves things? And because we used the article, they couldn't come up with a proper name. They had to come up with something else. And from 3-year-olds, we typically got things like, he's a move man, he's a move thing. That's a real problem, right? Move man isn't productive, move thing is simply wrong. But by 4 to 4.5, we consistently got things like a mover. So they would take the verb stem move and add er to it for the agent. What we did was really extensive studies of this phenomenon with 3 to 5-year-olds. This was all done at Bing. But we also did the same study with other languages. So for instance, we worked in one of the cooperative villages in Israel, just outside Netanya, and collected similar data on Hebrew. What we found was that by 3 to 3.5, children gave us really good analyses, 93% of the time, of novel agent, noun, stem, and affix combinations. So things like biter. What does a biter do? And they would break it down very, very nicely. The very same children, when asked to produce agent nouns with a stem plus er, managed it only 55% of the time. So what we were finding was there was this big discrepancy between what they clearly understood and could actually analyze and even make explicit as an analysis, and what they could actually produce themselves. This general lag of production behind comprehension is true all over language acquisition. So it's not just a phenomenon with this kind of word coinage and word analysis, but it's there with acquiring any kinds of word endings, it's there with acquiring pronouns, it's there with acquiring question words. What we found was that children who were acquiring different languages attended to three major factors when they were coining new words. And here we had data from Hebrew, from Icelandic, from French. We looked at Russian. We looked at a whole lot of different languages. In some cases, we ran the identical studies in the in English and the other language. In other cases, we drew on other studies which either replicated our study later or looked at a similar phenomenon, maybe not quite the same format. And what we found was that children are very attentive to the simplicity of the word form. Early on, they make the fewest changes possible, except for making something from a verb into a noun or a noun into a verb. Depending on the language, one of these is productive and one isn't. So in English, what you find with simplicity of form is that you get these root compounds like lion book, and you get verbs like to broom from a broom. And these are very common as the earliest coinages you get in English. You also find they rely on transparency. They use stems that they already know and affixes they already know the meaning of. Now you could say, well, that's obvious, and in one sense it is, but what it means is that until they learn the meaning of an affix from having done the analysis, it doesn't ever appear in their coinages. And they are very attentive to the word patterns that appear in adult speech. So what's productive in adult speech is going to appear first among the kinds of coinages they learn in their first language. So in English, to give you an example, for agent nouns, you can use er, like mover. You can use ian, as in librarian, or you can use ist, like pianist. And what you find is that children always use er initially, but by 4.5 to 5, they know that you can use ian, but they don't really use it. they also notice IST, and they also notice it's associated with a particular domain, which is music. And so they hear pianist, and so they also will go with trumpetist, right? Which does not exist. But what they've done is make this little generalization about musical instruments and the person who can play them. And IAN comes in very late, and that is actually the rarest and the least productive in adult speech. We also collected always data from adults to see that our judgments did match the judgments at large, let's say, in the population. So this work on word formation allowed us to look at places where children had already assigned some meaning to these words, but now they had to put together the parts in a single word. What we've been doing more recently is looking at the kinds of meaning that children can derive sort of on the spot with adult-child interaction when they attend to both the gestures and the words that adults are using. So again, we're going back to some very young children, to 1- and 2-year-olds, and what I'm going to talk about is just the adult side of things for the moment. What we found is that they rely on adult gestures to direct their attention and to inform them sort of what they should be looking at. And as Eleanor Maccabee noted, parents differ a lot in how good they are at directing their kids' attention to something. And we saw this in spades. The youngest group we looked at were 1- and 1/2-year-olds, and some of the parents were incredibly good at managing this, and would be very persistent in that they would make up to 16 tries to get their child to attend. Others, if they couldn't get their child to attend with a couple of tries, gave up and went on to another object. So we certainly saw this going on. And adults rely on familiar words that the children know, which they give in context alongside any new word that they offer. What we found was that they offer labels for things, so they'll say things like, for a pair of swim goggles, these are goggles, they're called goggles, and then they'll hand them to the child, and the child tries to put them on, so the parent actually puts them on the child and said, yes, these are goggles, you use them when you swim, and then they'll take them off again. So they act on the objects when they are showing them. And when they talk about these sort of unfamiliar objects, they will talk about parts and properties. If it's something that moves, they'll talk about how it moves or show how it moves, the noise it makes, what function it might have. So if you have a sieve for straining, they'll demonstrate that function as well. And when they do this, they use indicating gestures, different kinds of pointing or showing, or demonstrating gestures, along with their talk about these parts and properties. And just to give you an idea, this is the sort of correlation that you see. When adults talk about parts and properties of an unfamiliar object, they use pointing to point to the part or the property they're talking about. If they are talking about actions and functions, 94% of the time they actually do a demonstration of the action or function on the object itself. So they'll show how a crocodile moves or bites, and they'll make it bite the child's finger. This is, as a toy, but make the actual toy do it. So they are manipulating this and doing the demonstration on toy as they're talking about it. Now, 1- and 1/2-year-olds don't have much vocabulary. In fact, the mean production vocabulary of the children at 1 and 1/2 in this study was something like 29 words. So, but notice that the pointing is always highlighting what it is the parent is considering important about this new object. And when they demonstrate, they're giving a very direct illustration of the property. So even if the child doesn't attend to any of those words or make anything of them at that stage, presumably they are learning that these are important properties of this kind of object. And when they do get the vocabulary, they are ready to map it more directly. So this is the sort of thing that we have been focusing on, trying to look at what kinds of meaning are being offered and how accessible they are to very young children in this kind of interaction. And so what the sort of general findings we've made is that children do, when they assign meanings to unfamiliar words, they make use of conceptual categories they've already established, words for categories that they already know alongside ones that are new, words for properties, again, ones they already know, Like, for instance, they know a whole lot of body part terms by age 2, but they don't know terms for parts of a truck at age 2. And they refine the meaning of each word, of course, over time until it eventually is going to match adult usage, the adult conventions for that language. Okay, what I'd like to do is just conclude with a very few words about what's always made Bing so ideal for me and for my students as a research lab. First, there's the incredible cooperation of the teachers and families at Bing, support of the directors, especially Jean Lepper and Jennifer Winters, who are probably the two that I knew best. I knew Edith Dowley, but only sort of in passing. And the invaluable coordination done by Jawa Ye for all the research projects that are going on in any one quarter. She makes sure that there's always a research room available. The physical setup at Bing, the game rooms with observation windows for carrying out experiments, as well as all the outdoor spaces. And I must say that with the 2-year-old room, I have done lots of my work out in the sand pool in the 2-year-old's room, because that's where children will be willing to sit for 10 minutes with me while I have a tape recorder and a microphone and can show them pictures. They will actually stay there. So that I value immensely. And then finally, all the families, the parents whose interest in and commitment to participating with their children in our attempts to answer so many questions about the development of language and the developmental stages that children go through, as well as all the other developmental questions that they have committed to letting us try to answer by sending their children to Bing. Thank you.